Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. I'm, of course, your host of Geek-Stew, and of course also the host of today's video, Horror Stew. Oh yes, here we are, guys. I'm so excited to be back. Not that I went anywhere, but I'm always excited to make new content. And if you can't tell, I'm wearing my Macho Man shirt because, oh yeah, that's my very poor Macho Man impression for those folks who are interested. But today, guys, we're starting off Horror Stew with a continuation of the last two videos. In the first video of this series, I ranked the Resident Evil games of the mainline series. So basically any game that was a remake or an original game with a number in the title, I ranked. And then the follow-up video was all of these spin-off and some of the offshoot games that I enjoyed. You know, is a ranking as well. So it was all the games such as Survivor, Dead Aim, Survivor 2, Outbreak, all kinds of stuff. So I went in and did the rankings for those. And I mentioned in both videos that I really didn't know where to put Code Veronica. So that's what we're going to talk about today, guys. Today, we're going to kind of break down the Code Veronica Conundrum, and I'm going to kind of give an idea of where I believe the game should fall, whether or not if it's a spinoff, whether I think it's canon, do I think that it belongs in the mainline series. I'm also going to talk about mostly in regards to whether or not I like the game. Now, obviously, I talked about other games that I liked, and this is no exception, so that's what we're going to do today, guys. We're going to talk about Code Veronica and the conundrum that the game is. Oh, man. All right. So where do we start? Where do you start with Code Veronica? Let's start with why I don't like it. Code Veronica is a long-ass game. It is a 11.5-hour game. Now, most games are under 10 hours unless you're looking at like Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, or 0. And some of those include potential extra stuff. But most of the games can be played normally within under a 10-hour span. Code Veronica, no. Code Veronica comes in at a whopping 11.5 hours. Now, obviously, that time may differ between gamer to gamer because I might be able to complete the game quicker than you can because I've played the games before or whatever the case may be. Irregardless, Code Veronica is a long-ass game. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but I wanted to start off with it being long because that's part of the reason why I couldn't finish it. I got through most of it, and I was like, man, it's such a long game, and I had to go away and play something else, and I came back, and I just didn't have the motivation to play it. Irregardless, Code Veronica is also really boring. Now, I don't mean that the game is boring in regards to the content, necessarily. Like, the concept and the monsters and the gameplay is all fun and great, but there's so much back and forth. And if you don't know what you're doing and you're not following a walkthrough and you're just playing it from the basis of never having played the game before, it is so much back and forth. I go back and forth between the facility and the fucking mansion 100 times just trying to figure out what I'm doing. And I can never figure it out. Now, obviously, I've gone back and I've played through them additionally, but that is such a wild concept to me that this game would just provide such a what I would consider is just such a boring, like, why would you enter such a boring idea into a game where I need to go back and forth between these two places 100 times just to progress? Irregardless of that, boss fights are absolute fucking bullshit. And I know if you've not played Code Veronica, you know what I'm going to say if you have, but if you've not played Code Veronica, the tyrant fight on the plane literally makes me want to blow my brains out. Literal dog shit. Okay, literal dog shit. So in the boss fight, and I'll put a little sum up here for it, but in the boss fight, you basically have to get the tyrant to the end, and you have to make him kneel down. And when he kneels down, that means he takes damage, and you send the thing, there's like a cargo crate, and you send it down, and it hits him and knocks him out of the plane. Now, I've heard that you don't actually have to get him down on one knee, you don't actually have to damage him, but he can catch the cargo crate and push it back. I've heard that you just have to do it a bunch of times and it eventually happens, but irregardless of how you do it, why would you include that in the game? It is such tight quarters and you're going to take damage. And not only are you going to take damage in this boss fight, but you're going to take damage in the boss fight that leads up to this boss fight, as well as other subsequent areas in the game. So there's so much unavoidable damage. That's another thing, is there's so much unavoidable damage, and it's a survival horror game, so you have limited resources. So you're going to use up all your resources just trying to get through it, and then boom, you're just done. I mean, limited resources plus unavoidable damage is just dog shit. Because in Resident Evil and any of the other Resident Evil games, I can't think of a single time where you have to take damage. Like, for instance, in Resident Evil 3, you can pretty much evade everything. In Resident Evil 2, there's always something that you can do to avoid taking damage. In this game, it's almost as if there's no way to avoid it because there's no dodge mechanism. A lot of the boss fights are in such close quarters that it just makes it it's very undoable to do. That being said, the game itself has so many issues, like in that regard, that it makes me not like Code Veronica. Okay? It makes me not like Code Veronica, and it's hard for me to sit down and play it because when I play it, I get mad, right? And I've played all the other Resident Evil games, so I know somebody in the comments is going to be like, oh, Code Veronica is such a good game, you're just trash. That may be true. But if somebody like myself who has played all these other Resident Evil games and I come back and I'm like, let me give Code Veronica another try, and I can't humanly bring myself to beat the game, then there's an issue. But regardless of that, I've talked about all the stuff that I don't like about the game. There are other things that I could go on about, but now I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that I do like. Because don't get me wrong, the game has its issues, but there are some positive things about the game. So let's do that next. Let's talk about what is good about Code Veronica. So, the good stuff. In my opinion, I like the concept of the game. I like the story of the game, and I like that there are things that you can do in the game that can make changes to the outcome of later parts of the game. Such as, I cannot remember his name, but there was the guy in the very beginning in the prison cell who lets you out who was injured. If you bring him the hemostats, then he will survive and provide Chris additional support when Chris's part comes in. I do like the multi-character idea. I do like the fact, like in Resident Evil, you can play, or Resident Evil 3, you can play as both Carlos and Jill, because Jill is through most of the story, and then there's one part where you play as Carlos. And it's nice, because when a game offers you a brief reprieve from playing as the main character, it keeps your interest. The issue is that it takes so long to get to that reprieve that it sometimes, for me at least, made it hard to enjoy. So, I do like that concept. I do like the idea of having multiple characters and different stories happening during the game. In addition to that, the game itself does have some really unique options and items. For instance, it has some really cool weapons. It has some really cool monsters. I cannot remember the name of them, but they have one gigantic arm and they just reach and they latch onto stuff and they pull towards you and stuff. Those monsters are legitimately terrifying. They're legitimately horrifying, and they are a very formidable enemy. They're bullet sponges, which honestly adds to the terror because you're just pumping them full of lead and they're not going down. That being the Bandersnatch. They're called Bandersnatches. I remember that time, guys. But the Bandersnatches, they're such a good enemy. They're very cool, creepy looking. They're very cool. Honestly, I'd love to see them make a reappearance in a latter game, or if they ever remake Code Veronica, I definitely want the Bandersnatches back. But also, they have cool weapons. I don't know if I already said that, but you get some really cool options to work with inside the story. And in addition to that, the story itself is good. Like I mentioned, I enjoy the story of Code Veronica. If somebody made a Code Veronica movie, I would love a Code Veronica movie. But I don't like playing the game because of how inconsistent it is with the story and how good the game is. And in addition to that, there are actually some really interesting cutscenes that go along with the story. Everything to do with Alfred and Alexia Ashford are really cool cutscenes. Getting to see the dynamic between the two of them, and when Alfred is eventually injured and he goes and lets Alexia out of her hibernation or whatever. In addition to that, there's some really creepy cutscenes, like the one where it's talking about how it's like the dragonflies and they're pulling the wings off the dragonfly inside the mansion or whatever. Or even further than that, there are some really creepy scares, like when you're in the bunks of the prison and the zombie comes in through the window, and that's where you pick up the machine guns or whatever. But it's got a really cool scare and vibe to it that really is enjoyable. So it's like there are such good things that are going for the game, but there's just a lot of bad stuff that overrides it. Now, this being said, I think we really need to move on to whether or not I believe the game to be canon, where I would put it in the series, or would I just consider it a spinoff and call it a day? Now, I will warn you that I did read up on this, and I kind of read what other people were saying, so mind you that this is going to be a conglomeration of a bunch of stuff that I've read on the internet, as well as my own experiences with the game. So let's jump into whether or not I think this is real, or if we're in a simulation. I'm kidding. But let's jump into whether or not Code Veronica is in canon. So as the title says, Code Veronica Conundrum, and this part's really going to be the major conundrum to me. Obviously, I've talked about the game itself, why I like it, why I dislike it, but really the conundrum to me falls where do I think the game fits into the story? Do I think it's canon? Officially, the game is canon, okay? In an official stance, the game is part of the mainline story, okay? So irregardless of whether or not I like the movie or the game, it is part of the game. It's still a canon entry into the series, and I have to accept that in my heart and my soul, okay? I don't personally think it is. For the main issue that is never referenced again in the games. So this game was actually meant to be a direct sequel to Resident Evil 2. Obviously, if you've never played the game, then you wouldn't really know the concept, but basically, Claire is trying to look for Chris because that's what she was doing in Resident Evil 2. She makes it out of Resident Evil 2, and she's going into Code Veronica. She goes to, she didn't even go to Ashford Island. She went to elsewhere, and she got arrested and then sent to Ashford Island, which is essentially a prison island. And she is put in jail, and they're basically just hanging on to her for a rainy day. Honestly, I don't know. But basically, the premise of this game is that she gets put into the jail. She's trying to find answers, and now she's trying to get off the island because, this shit's about to blow. But that obviously doesn't come into play until a little bit later. But she tries to get off the island irregardless, and she sends a message to Leon, and then Leon forwards that message to Chris. Chris flies in on a jet or whatever, and basically saves it. Not necessarily saves the day, but basically comes for her, and then everything else is good to go. But regardless of the story, it's never really referenced again in the future titles. Now, obviously, we haven't really seen much of Claire in many of the future titles. I'm trying to think if she really was, and I'm really drawing a blank. Maybe Resident Evil 6, if she was in Resident Evil 6. I might be mistaking my female characters in the Resident Evil franchise, but maybe she was in one of the Revelations. It's been a long time. Yeah, maybe she was. I think it was Claire and Mora were the two characters in Revelations. Claire has been in a lot of the movies. She was in Degeneration as well as the other animated films. And I believe there's also another animated film that's coming out on Netflix this next year that's going to include her as well. So, we really haven't heard a lot from Claire in regards to the video games. We've not had a whole lot of FaceTime with her. Obviously, we've seen other characters such as Chris in the Resident Evil 7 franchise, as well as other characters in the other subsequent franchises prior. So that being said, Code Veronica does provide some important details because obviously Resident Evil 3 was the game that they put in the mainline series in lieu of putting Code Veronica. Not that that's a bad thing, but Resident Evil 3 does fit into the timeline because it happens during the same time as Resident Evil 2. But Code Veronica does establish that the main character of the series is going to be Chris, and that the main premise of the story is Chris's story. Because I actually watched a really interesting video about this, but this Resident Evil, as you see it happen, if you read the novels, Chris is very much a pinnacle of everything, really. Everything's about finding Chris. Everything's about doing this and this for Chris. And it makes sense in a way because especially with how the games are moving now. I mean, you see that Chris was in Resident Evil. He was in Resident Evil 1. He was in Resident Evil Code Veronica. Both of those games were kind of centered around them in some way because Code Veronica was about, and Resident Evil 2, they were both about Claire finding Chris. Resident Evil 1, part of the game is playing as Chris, and part of the game is, if you play as Jill, is trying to find Chris and the other people. In addition to that, you have Resident Evil 5, which is about Chris's work with the BSAA. Resident Evil 6 is again him getting back into the BSAA, and rather than being a an abhorrent alcoholic. Resident Evil 7 is his official return to the new Umbrella Corps, where he is basically fighting BOWs. And Resident Evil 8, if you've watched the trailers, about Chris. So it's like this two-sided coin. On one side, it's like Code Veronica was important because it is setting the stage for the latter games, because it paints Wesker as the villain, officially, and it paints Chris as the main protagonist. Because as you may remember, Resident Evil 4 was the first time we see Wesker since Resident Evil 1. But a lot of people don't remember that in Code Veronica, he literally is one of the main antagonists. He's one of the evil guys, right? So Code Veronica has a lot of important moments, but it's never referenced again in future games. There's always other games that can take place of the information that's provided in Code Veronica, and that's part of the reason why I kind of doubt, or kind of almost subtly dissuade myself from thinking that it is actually a canonical title. Irregardless of that, though, Code Veronica does have a very important part of our history, because it is one of those first games that basically the phrase that I'm looking for is that Code Veronica could potentially work better if it were remade. And I definitely feel that. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stop rambling about Code Veronica, and we're going to go into final thoughts. We're going to cut this down, and we're going to rock and roll here. So final thoughts on the Code Veronica conundrum. Oh, man. So I've said the word Code Veronica 100 times in this video. So I think at the end of the day, here's what I'm going to say. Code Veronica is important because it has a lot of important details for the franchise, but the game itself is so shit that I don't like it. There's a lot of stuff about the game that I really can't bring myself to like, and even though there are things that I do enjoy about the game, there's still a lot to be desired. And that being said, I think that it's very important, given the content of the game, that we still consider it, because it does, again, have so much important shit for the latter games. Setting up Wesker as the villain, setting up Chris as the main character. I mean, these are shockwaves that we feel in the modern Resident Evil games. However, my one final thought that I would want to pose to anybody out there who cares is that if they were to remake Code Veronica, I genuinely think I would like it. Because one of the big things that the remakes do is not only are they creating a game for a modern audience, but they're also creating a game that's going to, hopefully, they're creating a game that is improving on the original game. Obviously, Resident Evil Remake didn't quite accomplish that, but Resident Evil 2 Remake, for instance, is honestly a shining example. Even the Resident Evil 1 Remake did improve upon the original game and the original content. So I think that a remake of Code Veronica could definitely improve upon the original game and make it more playable to me specifically, but I feel like a lot of people may share my opinions because, quite frankly, Code Veronica does have a lot of issues that really need answered, and I think a remake could do that. Irregardless, though, I'm going to stop it there. Hope you guys enjoyed. I know that I kind of left this out of the first two videos, and I really have enjoyed hearing some feedback from you guys in regards to what you thought your favorite Resident Evil games were, and I hope you guys continue to do that. Tell me what you guys think about Code Veronica. Do you like the game? Do you hate the game? Do you want to see a remake, or could you care less? That being said, hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you next time in our next episode of Horror Stew that will not be about Resident Evil. It'll be about something completely different since I've done 3 weeks of Resident Evil. But for now, guys, everybody out there, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, and keep on growing. See ya.